Today I'd like to welcome Aleecia McDonald. She's a PhD candidate in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and there she's a member of the Cylab Usable Privacy and Security Research Laboratory. Some of you may have heard of it. It's commonly referred to as CUPS. Her interests span the intersection of internet technology, policy, economics, and law. Aleecia's research includes the efficacy of industry self-regulation, behavioral economics, and mental models of privacy, network traffic analysis to combat spyware, automotive privacy, and RFID technology. In addition to experience working for software startups, Aleecia holds a master's in public policy and management and a BA in professional writing, both from Carnegie Mellon. Her findings have been featured in media outlets such as the Washington Post, Ars Technica, Free Press Media Minute, and have contributed to testimony before the Federal Trade Commission. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Aleecia.
Thank you so much to Jenny for setting this up and for that great introduction. It's been a long time to get this together, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today. So today, first I'm going to go over a couple of things by way of background, so we're all talking about the same things, and then I'll go very quickly through 3 different studies. The first one has to do with behavioral advertising. It's a small study of 14 people. We did in-depth interviews with them. The second study follows that up with a larger online study. And then the third study looks at types of advertising beyond behavioral advertising. So together, these are 3 papers, about 66 pages, maybe a little bit longer. I'll just be hitting the highlights. When these papers are published, they'll be up on the website at cups.cs.cmu.edu. And I'll finish the talk if we have time today. We may run out of time. But if we have time, I'll talk about some implications for technologists, in people in education, and in public policy. So advertisers have a common problem. One of the first owners of department stores complained that half of the money he spent on advertising was completely wasted. His problem was he didn't know which half. So as mass media with radio and television rolled out across the country, advertisers were able to reach the entire country instantaneously, all at once. And they had the problem that very few products have universal appeal. So if they could, they wanted to tailor the ads that they purchased to just be to the people who were interested in those products or services that they were selling. And the internet has some unique properties that allow it as a mass media to help further that goal of tailoring. So today we'll be talking about 5 different types of internet advertising. So contextual, the basic idea here is that if you're selling a product for quilting, put it on a quilting website, not a golfing website. If you're selling golf tees, don't advertise to quilters. For behavioral, the basic idea is that somebody goes to a bunch of different websites. They may have different search terms. All of that information is aggregated together. Then there's a behavioral profile based on that raw data. So here, for somebody searching for different hobbies and retirement, we might have a category of likely over 50 years old. And then advertisers use those categories. For example, perhaps retirement planners would be interested in people likely over 50 years old to target their ads to those people. And then affiliate marketing is interesting because this is a term that has sort of 2 different meanings. The first meaning has been affiliates of other companies. This might be sort of a multi-level marketing kind of a deal. Some people have suggested that be renamed performance marketing. And there are people who think of the affiliates in affiliate marketing more as sort of a friend-to-friend marketing. But rather than try to decide between these 2 definitions, we have a great example of both. Facebook's Beacon program, which did have both of those elements. So that's kind of the model that I'm using when I talk about affiliate marketing today. And if affiliate is difficult, I'm not even going to try to define the cloud. There are plenty of articles that fail to do that. But the basic idea for cloud-based advertising is that you have some files, perhaps email, photos, things along those lines that are hosted elsewhere in cloud computing, and then advertising is based on the content of those files and displayed. And finally, deep packet inspection based. The idea here is you have a server, maybe it's your ISP, and you have a file, say email, and you're sending it around. So that file is broken into smaller pieces called packets, And the inspection of the packets, the content in the packets while they're in transit is the hallmark here. And so again, it's advertising based on the content of files that people are sending or transferring around. So of these 5 different types, one of these things is not like the others. For contextual, if you're an advertiser, what you need to know about is the website you're choosing to put your ads on. For the other 4 types, what you need to know about is the person you are advertising to. In fact, it doesn't matter at all which website the ads are hosted on. You just care about the characteristics of the person you're targeting. So then to do that, you need user data, and where there's user data, there are privacy issues. And that brings me to what we're talking about today. So there are privacy issues around the data that's being collected, around the inferences that are being drawn about all of that data that's being collected, and then sometimes also about the categories people are being placed in. There's another wrinkle to this too, which is that some of this data is inherently non-anonymized in its raw form. And we saw this with the example of AOL releasing their search terms. People ego surf, they search for their own names, they search for their social security numbers, they search for their home address. IP addresses are classified legally as personally identifiable information in some countries. There's a great paper that came out recently from Peter at EFF about browser fingerprinting. 80% of web browsers are unique based on characteristics of the web browsers. And a clever advertiser looked at typing patterns to differentiate people on a particular computer. This is back to the concept of a typing fist from telegraph operators. They could tell who the other telegraph operators were just based on the way that dots and dashes were put across the line. So if you imagine that now with typing, those patterns are uniquely identifiable, especially if you're just down to a couple of users on a given machine. So these are things that inherently have some aspects that are personally identifiable, but they're useful bits of data. So we have this tension where advertisers want as much data as possible so that they can target their ads, and then there are a lot of concerns users have about how that data is collected, the inferences drawn, and the categories they're placed into. So I'm going to give you just sort of 3 things to think about while I go through these different papers I'll be referring to. So the first one to kind of keep in mind is a sort of little mini preview, is that people genuinely have different privacy preferences. Now, if they didn't, this would be simple. We could say, these things are private, these things are public, we're going to have a complete division, we'll pass a law, we're done, everybody go home. It would just be implementation and an engineering problem from then on. But it's more complicated than that. A second thing to kind of watch for is the interaction with people's mental models of online things. So a mental model is just the internal representation that people have of how something works. So for example, if my mental model is that anytime I see a link at the bottom that says privacy policy, if I believe that means that my privacy is protected by law, and there's a study that shows that's the case, then why would I even click the link and look at all of that legalese? I'm already protected, right? So that's the type of thing that can happen where somebody's mental model of understanding how the world works is off, and it affects their privacy decision making. And the third sort of thing to keep in mind is this concept of industry self-regulation that we have in the United States. Rather than a lot of laws, a lot of regulation from a group like the Federal Trade Commission, instead industry is to set up guidelines and be sort of self-policing. This requires that users know enough to be able to enact any preferences that they have about privacy. Now, the good news is this enables people to make different decisions, especially as we saw in the first, they have different preferences. But the bad news is there's a really high knowledge bar. So kind of look at where that knowledge bar needs to be for them to make the decisions versus what you see through these studies. So the first one was these in-depth interviews. And we talked to 14 people with semi-structured interviews. I had a list of questions I asked everybody, plus follow-up in depth based on things that they told me. And these were people recruited in Pittsburgh. They were all over 18. This sample was skewed young. Half of them were under age 30. And they came from diverse backgrounds. So just some highlights of the results. We asked about identification of internet advertising. The first asked about Google search. All 14 of the participants use Google search. It is their favorite search bar none. They all understand that there are ads with the results on Google search. Even without a screenshot in front of them, they were able to say where the ads were. They're down the side, they're across the top. They were also able to talk about sponsored ads as meaning that it's something for pay. Now, their sort of knowledge horizon was that they didn't understand how it is that ads are paid for. But that's not bad. They understand the concept. In contrast, we showed a screenshot of the New York Times, and they were not able to identify, even with the screenshot in front of them, what the ads were. There were some real differences of opinion. Now, some people just skipped everything that wasn't a picture. Now, clearly people understand that text links can be ads, or else they wouldn't have understood that with Google. So that's not the failing. But they thought anything that was just a text link could not be an ad. There were other people who saw ads as innately third party. So, for example, subscribe to the New York Times was not considered an ad. And then there was, at the far extreme, one individual who thought every single thing on the page was an ad, including the editorial content. She said, well, that's got to be some PR firm, right? It's a press release. So this is an advertisement, too. So we have genuine disagreements from people as to what is an ad. Now, why does this matter? We're asking people to manage data flows from advertisements, but people don't even agree on the baseline of what are ads. So if you try to explain to people what's the difference between a first party and a third party, they're not even sure that there are ads there necessarily, which makes things very complicated. So there was more confusion about the technology behind a lot of advertising. A third of the people I talked to, when I asked them just point blank, what's a cookie, answered, I'm not sure. They could generally give some characteristics of how cookies are used, but they didn't really understand what they were or how they worked. And only one person mentioned that there might be unique identifiers. 3 people did mention that it has something to do with advertising. But a fair number of people gave answers that were actually wrong. Only a little bit more than a third were able to give an answer that did not have some component that was just flat out wrong. So that's challenging. It's 2010, and your users don't know what cookies are. Very few people had ever heard of third-party cookies. The problem here was not the phrase third party, which surprised me. They understand what a third party is. They just don't know what a cookie is. If they understand what a cookie is, a third-party cookie will come for free. And no one had heard of flash cookies or LSOs. We asked a whole bunch of other concepts as well. Nobody had heard of them. So we had some real confusion here. One person explained that with deleting cookies, hyperlinks in different colors go away. And that's what it does. It clears the navigation history. So we had this real confusion between cookies and history, possibly cookies and browser cache. People told us that if you delete cookies, then pages take longer to load. It's probably that they've blown away all of the images in their cache, and that's what's taking longer. And this could perhaps be due to web browser user interfaces. So, for example, this may be a little bit difficult to read for the remote sites, but if you look at the UI to clear cookies in different browsers, you have to go under settings that say history. You have a default that clears all things together. So if people just click yes or okay, they're going to be clearing out a bunch of different things at the same time. And the exception to this is there's one browser, Opera, which does have cookies by themselves and actually even tries to give a little bit of definition. Cookies are small files stored on your computer. They allow websites to remember you between visits. And the default is accept cookies only from the site I visit. So they avoid third-party versus first-party distinction by the way they phrase it. It's a nice attempt. It's not clear it does enough, but they at least try to distinguish these different topics. So the decisions web browser manufacturers are making may be affecting how people think things work online. We asked people about the risks and benefits and their concerns around internet ads and found sort of 3 general categories. 1, people think that internet ads are necessary. They understand free content is supported by them. 2, and the most common adjective used was they find them annoying. That's mostly about pop-ups. That's mostly about spam, which people think of as internet advertising. In fact, Google search was praised universally for not being invasive, annoying, singing, dancing, primary colors, So that got a lot of good. And the final category was concerning, which usually had to do with privacy. There was a wide range, particularly on targeted ads. So some people like the idea that they get more interesting ads that are relevant to them personally, and some people feel like the ads are preying on the vulnerable. And those two concepts came across. So for advertising views, most people were pragmatic. It's not that they sat there saying ads are terrible. Instead, they don't really like ads, but they're kind of resigned to it. A phrase that was used a lot was ads are a fact of life. One person used a lovely analogy of internet ads are like somebody walking slowly on the sidewalk in front of you. There's just nothing you can do about it, so, just go with it. But while they accept the concept that ads support free sites, they don't think that their data is part of that deal. They think the ads themselves are, but not the data. And so here we come back to this concept of mental models. In the offline world where people are used to advertising for the past 100 years, they're not used to their data going out. They're just used to passively receiving ads. And so here they don't understand the data flows behind it, and it's not something that they've had to think about until very recently. So there are a couple of analogies that were drawn. One was to shopping offline. And somebody explained, okay, well, you're in public, yes, but just because you're in public shopping, there's still privacy issues with companies knowing where you spend your money and time. Another analogy was to phone calls. And somebody gave his view that using the sort of data that's used for behavioral advertising has to be illegal, because recording phone calls can be illegal. And there are certain cultural norms and expectations to privacy. So these models that they have of how things work in the offline world carry over to the online world. So just a little bit of discussion here. People don't understand what's going on currently. Opinions range from enthusiastic support for relevant ads to real concern. And people are frustrated with the tactics of advertising that they see, especially pop-ups, even without understanding the data that's being collected. The other thing I should have noted at the very beginning is that we didn't prompt anybody about privacy. All of these studies were advertised about being about advertising. It was never, come talk about privacy. So when people mentioned privacy, and they all did within the first 5 minutes, this was something unprompted that they were raising on their own, and privacy is central to how they view advertising online. So the second study was a follow-up on this. And we had 314 subjects for an online study recruited from Mechanical Turk. And again, these people were not primed for privacy. Once again, this is skewed younger. 64% of the sample ages 18 to 34, and again, skewed a little bit female. So some quick high-level findings from this. So in economics, there's the view that you can tell how much people value something by how much they will pay for it. In fact, that's sort of the definition of value. What we heard from people in the 14-person in-person study was that being asked to pay for privacy was extortion. They were really against the concept of paying for privacy, which they saw as a right. So that sort of flies in the face of the standard economics framing for how you value things. So we looked at kind of a classical economics approach in behavioral economics to how to kind of get a sense of how people value things, and contrasted two things that should give the same answer. The first was, would you pay an additional $1 per month to your ISP to avoid having your favorite news site collect your data for behavioral advertisements? And the second, which is just the same thing but flipped around, would you accept a discount of $1 per month off your ISP bill to allow your favorite news site to collect your data for behavioral advertisements? So this is very bounded. You should get the same answer to both questions, but we didn't. And this is known as a willingness to pay, which is the first case of how much you'd pay, versus a willingness to accept, the second case of how much discount would you accept, gap. So 11% would pay $1 a month to avoid having their data collected, and 31% said they would accept $1 a month in order to be paid to disclose this information. So a couple of different things here. First of all, this suggests that there may be an endowment effect going on here. An endowment effect is, again, an economics term. The canonical example for that was if you have a coffee mug and you give it to somebody and you say, how much is this mug worth? Once it's theirs, they value it for more money. If the coffee mug is on the table and you say, how much is this mug worth? They don't value it for as much, right? If you are endowed with it, if it's yours, you demand more money. So there's a question as to whether privacy also falls into this as well. And this suggests that it might, and it would be interesting to do more research here. So we followed up those questions on willingness to pay and willingness to accept with a couple of questions. First of all, these were all on a Likert scale. So we asked people, do you strongly disagree, which was coded as 1, disagree, etc., all the way to strongly agree, coded as 7. So that's what the mean Likert is there. So the most popular response was that privacy is a right, and it is wrong to be asked to pay to keep companies from invading my privacy, with 69% of people either strongly agreeing or agreeing with that statement, and only 3% disagreeing. Companies asking me not to pay them, companies asking me to pay for them not to collect data is extortion also scored very high, with 61% strongly agreeing or agreeing with that. At the complete contrast at the bottom, I hate ads and would pay to avoid them. Very few people actually agreed with that, only 11%. People were more neutral, you can see. But there's a very pragmatic approach here, right? But notice in the middle, it's not worth paying to avoid targeted ads. Most people agree with that. And the most concerning one, I think, on this is advertisers will collect data whether I pay or not. So there is no point in paying. That's a real lack of trust. 55% either strongly agree or agree with that statement. So that's kind of an issue if you're trying to build trust with your users. That trust is not there to start with. So then we asked about 2 different scenarios of things that are basically happening online today. In the first case, we asked them to imagine they visit the New York Times and they see ads for Continental Airlines, and said that ad does not come to you directly from the airline. Instead, there is an ad company that determines what ad to show you personally based on the history of prior websites you have visited. Your friends might see different ads if they visited the New York Times, and then ask them to answer if this is something that could happen or will not happen. So the majority of people said that yes, this is happening now, either a lot or a little. Over 80% believe that. Only 11% said it's not happening now, but it could happen in the future, and only 2% said that this would never happen. So the basic concept of behavioral advertising is at least understood. In contrast, we asked, imagine you're online and your email provider displays ads to you. The ads are based on what you write in email you send as well as email you receive. People do not think that this is going on right now. Right, so just a footnote to this as you're laughing. I went back and I looked at what email providers people used for this study, and 90% of them have some type of hosted email provider, Hotmail, Gmail, right? And they think that this is not happening. So it's not that they've just never seen it before. They really legitimately think this isn't happening right now. 25% say, yes, this is happening a lot now, 14% a little now, 28% say it could happen in the future, but it's not happening now. The interesting thing, 16% believe this could never happen, that it is currently banned by law, right? And we're back to those mental models. Well, you can't open my physical mail. How could you open my email? People think it's illegal. And then 13% say this could never happen because the consumer backlash would be so intense. And so, okay, it's not barred by law, but it still would just never occur. So there's some real surprise going on out there as people start to figure out what's happening. So we followed up, these are the same scenarios, the type's really small, but it's still up there, and asked, how would you feel about this practice if it happened? For the behavioral, people know what's going on, but they think it's creepy. And that was one of the adjectives from the small study of 14 people. 46 people find it creepy. 38% say they wouldn't even notice the ads, they'd just ignore them. 30% say no one should use data from internet history. That's a really broad statement, right? Almost a third of people agree with that as a normative statement. And then 18% say they'd be glad to have relevant advertisements about things they're interested in instead of random. That's pretty low. So in contrast, we look at email. No one should use data from email because it is private like postal mail, 62%. It is creepy to have advertisements based on my emails, 62%. Wouldn't even notice the advertisements. That's the same thing before for behavioral. They said 38%. Here it's 18% would just ignore them. Well, maybe more than 18% have been ignoring the ads. But that's the self-reported, right? Only 18% say they wouldn't notice them and that it wouldn't bother them as a result. Only 9% say it's okay as long as the email service is free. They are not agreeing with the concept that data is part of the deal. It's okay to have ads for free services, but not data. And finally, glad to have relevant advertisements about things I'm interested in instead of random advertisements, only 4%. So we also looked at people's mental models of how cookie data flows and presented 4 different models of how pieces of a web page come together. Yeah?
I'm actually curious, the way you did your surveys, when you put a question out there that says, this is just like physical mail, does that not impact the way people view as they answer the other question?
Can you repeat the question? Sure. So the question is, could asking no one should use data from email because it's private like postal mail instead bias people for the earlier questions so that they're more likely to say, no, you shouldn't do this? Is that a fair representation? Or later questions. I'd actually be more worried about later questions than earlier. That is absolutely something to think about. And for some of these, we had to be careful about the order we put the questions in. So there are some things that we do at the very beginning before they've seen the rest of the study. So I had less trouble, less concern about that with the small study of 14 people, where I could be more careful that that wasn't what was going on. But that's always going to be a concern with studies like this. It may give a small bias effect. I don't think it's a large one. Part of why I don't think it's a large one is because I did the smaller studies with 14, but that's sort of a judgment call. So yeah, with any study like this, order of questions is going to matter.
But email is not something you covered with 14.
Sure it is. Yeah. I'm giving you highlights of these. If you want to see the papers, please feel free as they come up. I'm going to actually postpone all other questions to the end because we're already running really tight on time, having started late. But absolutely, that's a good methodological question. So we showed 4 different possible mental models of how cookies work and asked 2 different questions. One was, which diagram do you think best illustrates how cookies usually work? And the other was, which, if any, could not happen? So I'm going to show you what these 4 look like one by one. The first one had some text with it. You can see that there are arrows going back and forth with cookies between a server, some ads, and a news article. The description was, the Times web server sets and reads cookies for all elements on the web page, including cookies associated with specific ads. So 22% think that this is how the internet works today. And this is pretty close to how the internet used to work. That's not a crazy answer. It's just things are more complicated today than this. And 9% say that this would not happen, which is wrong. This is how things used to be. The second one was, multiple web servers set and read cookies from the Times web page. So we have the Times server, an advertising server, and then a particular ad, a soda company server, all setting and reading cookies from the same page. 20% think that this is what's happening today, and only 18% think that this can't happen. So for the technical people in the room, you guys know that this isn't something that's going to happen without some hackery, right? This is not how the web works. So for the third one, the description was, only the Times server can set and read cookies on the Times web page. So this has no cookies being set by any advertisers. And 18% think that that's what's happening today. 15% say that this could not happen. And the final one, which is the one that looks closest to sort of the complexity level of what we're seeing in the market right now, is different servers set and read cookies from different parts of the Times web page. 40%, which is the largest group, say that this is what happens today, and 10% say that this is impossible. So the thing to note is that of the ones now, we had basically 3 that were all around 20%, 22, 20, and 18, and a small bump toward what's happening right now. 48% think that all of these images are possible. Basically, people just don't have a clue how this works. And they were looking at all 4 of these images at the same time to be able to kind of spend time and go over them. So on a different topic, we asked them about the network advertising initiative's opt-out cookies. So this is a mechanism of industry self-regulation. If people don't want behavioral advertising, they can opt out of that from various ad networks. And I'll read a paragraph or 2 from the description that people were able to read. It was, to opt out of an NAI member's behavioral advertising program, simply check the box that corresponds to the company from which you wish to opt out. Alternatively, you can check the box labeled Select All, and each member's opt-out box will be checked for you. Next, click the Submit button. The tool will automatically replace the specified advertising cookies and verify your opt-out status. In bold, opting out of a network does not mean you will no longer receive online advertising. It does mean that the network from which you opted out will no longer deliver ads tailored to your web preferences and usage patterns. We asked people, if you visited this website, what would you think it is? 34% said it's a website that lets you tell companies not to collect data about you. Well, that's not quite the case. So it actually depends on the company. For example, Google will replace your cookies with a cookie content that just says opt out. So the same data is being collected, but it's aggregated now with every other person who has a cookie that says opt out. Yahoo, in contrast, collects exactly the same data, nothing changes. So it really depends on which company. So 25% said it's a website that lets you tell companies you do not want to see ads from them, but you will still see as many ads overall. No, it doesn't change which companies you see ads from. That's not the point. 18% say a website that lets you see fewer online ads. Well, no, that's not what it does either. It doesn't change the quantity of ads. And the correct choice, 11% said a website that allows companies to profile you, but not to show you ads based on those profiles. And that's what's going on. And then the final 2, a scam website to collect your private information and a scam website to find out which websites you visited. These are again based on things that we heard from the small interviews of 14 people. Together, that 11% is equal to the 11% who correctly understood what's going on with the NA opt-out page. So a little bit of discussion on this second one. Unwillingness to pay for privacy is not the same thing as not valuing privacy. And that's a lot of negatives in one sentence, right? But that's probably the most precise way that I can get across that concept, that there are people who think that paying for privacy is wrong, even though they value their privacy highly. So current data practices are not understood, and the hosted email advertising example being really strong there, and they're not accepted. The mental models of data flows with the different pictures of cookies, people don't really understand what's going on there. And the NAI opt-out cookies description could use a rewrite, but it's going to be difficult to explain. I would have a hard time writing that up in under a few pages. Right? It's complicated because the underlying data is also complicated. Different companies do different things. So the third and final study I'll be talking about today looks at multiple types of advertising. And this is a similar structure to the second one. It was an online survey recruited from Mechanical Turk with 300 subjects. And for this one, there was a between subjects design. So half of the subjects saw one variant and the other half saw a slightly different variant. And I'll describe that a little bit more in a moment. So when we wanted to talk about these 5 different types of advertising that I started out discussing at the very beginning of this talk, we did a lot of pilot tests, and people have no idea what a phrase like affiliate marketing means. Just no clue, right? Even contextual advertising. They don't understand what this is. So we needed to somehow convey that to them to understand their preferences. And we found that giving definitions wasn't enough. So we needed to give examples. But that's a problem, right? I mean, we're coming back to that question that was asked before of how do you avoid biasing people? So what we came up with was we were going to give two very different streams of examples. One example is around scuba. Somebody's taken up a new hobby. That's something that's not really very privacy sensitive for most people. And the other example is around cancer. And that's something that we looked for that would have privacy implications, but also no sense of blame, no sense of this can't happen to me, that people would just discount the example. So that's why we picked cancer. Did I just go past 2 slides? No, good. So we asked about these 5 different types of advertising and gave them 8 different adjectives, and again the Likert scores for how much they agree or disagree that these adjectives fit these types of advertising. The 8 adjectives came from news articles, and also those included PR releases about different news services that are on the web. So those 8 adjectives were in order of popularity: invasive, pushy, creepy, concerning, helpful, reasonable, desirable, and entertaining. And sort of the big picture here, the 4 positive and the 4 negative were very similar. So I've just grouped those here. You can see that the contextual has the highest of the positives, and they drop as you go from contextual, behavioral, affiliate cloud, and DPI. And the negatives are the lowest for contextual, and they increase for behavioral, affiliate, cloud, and DPI. There are a couple of statistically significant differences between the scuba and cancer conditions. You can read the paper for the full details, but they're actually very few. They were very similar. So another question we asked is whether they would prefer to have random ads or if they would prefer that particular type of targeted ad. And for contextual, as you would sort of expect, most people would rather that their ads have something to do with the site that they're visiting, and a slight majority would prefer contextual to random. But as you start to get to the other types of ads, people would prefer random ads to behavioral, and there's a statistically significant difference between contextual and behavioral there. And affiliate cloud and DPI based, 75% would prefer to have random ads to that type of targeting. And there are no statistically significant differences between affiliate cloud and DPI, but that group is statistically significantly different from behavioral and contextual. So to sort of wrap up these 3 together, generally people just don't understand how the internet works, how ads work, or how data flows. The NAI opt-out description of opt-out cookies is not working as it's written right now. And current practices that are in use today are causing surprise when we describe them to people. In the 14-person study, I would describe things to people and say, how would you feel about? And they would look at me and say, well, that would never happen. And I would say, okay, well, if it happened, how would you feel about it? And they'd argue with me, right? And these were things that are all going on right now today. People are okay with the concept of ads for free sites, but don't think that data is part of the deal. And if given a choice, they would prefer to have random ads to targeted ads at the current time. That may change as people start to understand both the benefit of targeted ads and also the risks of some of the data flows that they're not aware with. But right now, 2010, that's their preference when they're giving self-reported data, which is another important caveat. All of this is self-reported. But a small subset really do welcome targeted ads, enthusiastically so. They want to see things that are relevant to them. They want new products. They want new services, things they would never find on their own. They think this is exciting. It would be great if we could find a way to serve those people. A larger subset, but still comparatively small subset, reject the concept of targeting ads completely. They see it as an invasion of privacy. They think it's a bad thing. The majority of people simply don't see a benefit to targeted ads. Why would they want better ads? Ads are slow people on the sidewalk in front of you, right? There's something that happens to you that you cope with. The idea of making them better isn't something that they're really interested in. They just want to ignore them and get on with their life. So we're running low on time. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Just a couple of points for technologists. Privacy is central to user experience. We're hearing about privacy, just talking about ads very, very quickly in these interviews. So design for it when you design products. Technologists have a vast and fast reach. They can change how people interact with things very quickly, and it's a very powerful role to have. But engineers may know too much to empathize with new users. Kind of that keeping a beginner brain can be really difficult. And engineers may also underappreciate that they're dramatically changing how people interact with this new media. Some decisions about a user interface for a web browser, it's just, okay, here's one more feature that has to get in by code complete. But it's actually changing how people are able to make decisions about their private data in a whole new scale, right? So that's sort of the type of thing to think about as you're dealing with these privacy issues. Testing is important. Testing the NAI description would have gone a long way. Testing browser interfaces for not just can people use them, can they click the buttons, but how does the whole interaction work? Do they understand what they're doing and why and what the implications are? There's sort of an extra level of testing beyond you click the button and the button worked. And finally, just keep in mind that mental models of offline systems are going to bleed into whatever online system you're designing. So sometimes you can take advantage of that, and that's a really powerful thing to be able to tap into, but be careful where they differ. That's where people get surprised, and that's where suddenly there can be a huge backlash and you have no idea where it came from. For educators, the polite way of putting this is that these findings remain stable over time. Right? 20 years ago, people didn't know what cookies are. 10 years ago, people didn't know what cookies are. 5 years from now, will people actually understand cookies? And to some extent, does it matter, right? I mean, how much do you know about how your car works? But if you don't know it needs the oil changed, it's a problem. Where it matters is where there are decisions you have to make where you interact with things. So those are the things where educators need to look at really training people about how things work. And there's a lot of work to be done here. Another point is that even the so-called digital natives, the generation after mine, don't understand what's going on for privacy, and they want to. So we had a free-form comment block at the end of these online studies, and we had a bunch of comments like this. I would love to learn more information about how to protect my privacy, especially with all of the horror stories of stolen identities. I need to know more about how my computer works. I should have put some of the others up here, but they wouldn't fit. There were people complaining about, I don't understand what you were even asking in this study. And we were going to people on Mechanical Turk. These are more tech savvy than average, right? So there's a real caution there. People desperately want information about how this works. Last, for policymakers, this notion that there's substantial surprise over current practices is important. As policymakers move away from the concept of fair information practices to underlie what works or doesn't work for privacy, surprise is becoming one of the things that they look at to determine if something is working well or not for users. Well, we've got a lot of surprise that's going on here. We have this issue that only a minority of people want targeted ads, but they're so enthusiastic about it. Is there some way that we can serve them while serving everybody else as well? I talked a little bit about this economic notion of the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept for the dollar discount versus dollar premium for privacy. That may also affect how people look at opt-in and opt-out. Now, we know most people just accept defaults, right? That's real. But on top of that, if you, for example, force people to make a decision, but you have a preference selected, that may also affect how much they value their privacy based as whether they see the privacy as theirs or the data as someone else's. That would be a great thing to start to look into more for future work. We have this issue where users may not be able to identify ads. So in the industry self-regulation approach for behavioral advertising, the NAI and others have suggested that widget makers be treated as first parties for data. And a widget maker puts up, say, today's weather in a little box in the upper corner in your website. The idea is that users are supposed to know that that widget did not come from the New York Times. It came from the widget maker, and that the data flow goes to the widget maker, and therefore it is a first-party data relationship with the widget maker. That's not going to work, not in real life. I think there's some real problems there that should be tested more thoroughly than my absolute statement there. But there's some real concerns I have as to how people could possibly understand, especially when widgets are designed to be brandable and integrate with sites and all of those good things that we want from widgets. And the final question here is, does self-regulation make sense as an approach when users don't have the knowledge to be able to make decisions at this moment? So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions. Yep.
I was wondering, in one of your studies, you asked users whether something was happening or whether it was not happening, whether it was not happening because it was illegal. I wonder how many users would say that something was happening but was illegal, but those laws were going unenforced, or nobody cared that it was illegal. Like that.
So to repeat the question was, I had asked if people think a practice is either happening a lot or a little right now, or is not happening in particular because it's illegal. How many people would answer, well, it's happening, but it is illegal? That's a great question. I didn't ask it. So the implication of the question and the follow-up was, like, for example, spam. But that's kind of interesting because if you look at the CAN Spam Act, a lot of things that you might think are illegal turn out to be legal. So it gets murky there too. For some really good study of what people do and don't believe for laws, there are some things that have come out of Annenberg and Berkeley. And you can look, there's specifically a study done about Californians and their view of laws and privacy. Chris Hufnagel, and Jennifer King from Berkeley, and it's a really nicely done study. There are a bunch of other people on that, and I'm going to be embarrassed that I didn't just name them all. I think it's a 7-name author string or something like that. But there's some really good work that I didn't replicate that you could look at that would probably start to answer that question better than I did. Yes?
Users differentiate between behavioral data gathered from websites they have visited versus behavioral data that they express themselves on a site. Like in Facebook, I tell them my age, my gender, my location, even though I may never visit sites that are.
It's a great question. So the question was, are users differentiating between behavioral data collected about them by the actions they take online, sort of as a side effect, versus data that they're providing? They go to Facebook and they provide their gender, their age, the city they live in. So I didn't look at that in particular, but I can talk about something related that I think ties in, which is users believe if they aren't logged into a site, they're completely anonymous and that data is not being collected. So they think that if they're logged into Google or Facebook, which were the examples they gave me, that yes, that information they provided, actually Yahoo was the third one they gave me, that information they provided when they signed up is of course available to those services. And they understand that because they provided it. But they think that if they are not currently logged in and visiting that site, that they're completely anonymous, there's nothing being tracked about them at all. So I think the reason I didn't hear that distinction is because they don't even understand it exists. So the follow-up was, it's not that the data is being tracked, it's that it wouldn't be used. They don't even think it's being tracked. So how can it be used if it's not? Like they don't even question it, right? On the internet, nobody can tell you're a dog, right? People really are back in that mindset that if they aren't logged into a service, they're completely anonymous. Now, there are plenty of people who know otherwise, and I get in trouble when I use a broad brush like that, right? There's going to be a subsection of users who understand what an IP address is even. But the vast majority of people think that they are perfectly anonymous online. Yes?
Can you just give a sense of the time frame when these surveys were done?
Sure, time frame of when the surveys were done. So they're actually out of time frame from what I presented. The oldest one, the one with 14 people who came into the lab, that occurred about a year ago. It was last summer, and that happened before a lot of privacy things that are in the news right now, right? So I've watched concern increase over time, and I haven't been able to quantify it, which is a shame. That would have been lovely if I could. Then the middle one, which was the cancer versus scuba study, that's probably about 6 months old. And then the follow-up, which was the follow-up to the small study, that's maybe 3 months old, if even. That one kind of, yeah. So we are over time. I'm happy to continue talking to anybody who has further questions. We can go back by the ping pong tables, and I'll stay as late as anybody would want, but I know there's probably another talk that's going to come in, and I should let the room be free. So thank you guys so much for your time and attention.